In 1987, inside the corporate offices of Thorn EMI, a British electronics empire quietly surrendered. The Ferguson Radio Corporation, a name that had built millions of wireless sets for British homes, was sold outright to the French state-owned Thomson Group. The vast domestic manufacturing scale vanished. The Enfield factory floors eventually emptied. High-street electrical shops that once stacked Ferguson radiograms and transistor portables by the dozen had to accept a new reality. The familiar badge remained on the shelf, but the British engineering behind the tuning dial was gone. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. Ferguson was the default sound of the affordable British sitting room, built by domestic workers, tuned to domestic frequencies, and trusted by millions of families. But the real story of Ferguson is not only the story of a corporate sale in 1987. It is the story of how a company built to bring mass-market audio into the working-class home was ultimately dismantled by the global wave of imported good-enough electronics. Every week, we tell the stories of British wireless makers and the listening habits that shaped how the country heard the world, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with a corporate takeover, but in a specific place, Enfield, in 1936. Before a wireless set could become a fixture of the British working-class sitting room, it first had to overcome the structural economics of the British radio market. In the early 1930s, the national broadcasting infrastructure was expanding with immense ambition. Broadcasting House stood as a monument to the spoken word. The Droitwich transmitting station, opened in 1934, pushed a massive long-wave signal across the British Isles, ensuring that the BBC could reach even the most remote counties. The signal was in the air. The voices were waiting to be heard. But the physical receiver required to capture that signal remained stubbornly expensive. The British radio industry at the time was heavily restricted by a powerful component monopoly. The British Radio Valve Manufacturers Association, a trade cartel, effectively controlled the pricing of electronic valves. Because a valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, required several of these fragile, complex components to function, the base cost of building a wireless set was artificially high. Added to this were the costs of solid timber cabinets, heavy tuning capacitors, and the skilled labor required to wire chassis by hand. For the affluent, this was merely the price of modern entertainment. A premium table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, could easily cost between 12 and 15 pounds. In a decade where the average industrial worker might earn barely £3 a week, a new wireless set represented a monumental capital investment. Working-class families either saved for months, relied on outdated and inferior crystal sets, or committed to expensive, long-term hire purchase agreements. The British market was hungry for domestic audio, but it lacked a manufacturer willing to break the pricing structure of the establishment. The disruption did not come from an established radio engineer, but from an outsider who understood the brutal mathematics of mass production. Jules Thorn, an Austrian-born businessman who had settled in Britain, possessed a unique understanding of how to dismantle a cartel. He had already fought a vicious battle against the British electric lamp monopoly, importing cheaper European bulbs before setting up his own domestic manufacturing to undercut the established giants. Thorn realized that the exact same restrictive practices were choking the radio market. The British public did not necessarily demand hand-polished walnut cabinets or luxury prestige. They simply wanted the BBC in their homes, reliably, and at a fair price. In 1936, Thorn made his move. He acquired the British trademark rights to Ferguson, a name originally associated with a struggling American radio venture, and completely reinvented it as a British manufacturing powerhouse. The Ferguson Radio Corporation was established, and Thorne secured a factory site on the Great Cambridge Road in Enfield, North London. Enfield was not meant to be a boutique workshop. It was built for volume. Thorne's philosophy was entirely focused on scale and efficiency. If he could produce chassis on a massive scale, standardize the components, and bypass the traditional expensive suppliers, he could drastically reduce the retail price of a wireless set. The early Ferguson receivers were a revelation in pragmatic engineering. They did not attempt to compete with the avant-garde Art Deco plastics of EKCO or the bespoke naval-grade engineering of Murphy. Instead, a Ferguson set offered a sturdy, respectable wooden cabinet, a clear glass tuning dial, the scale that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, and a standard, reliable valve circuit. Crucially, the price was entirely disruptive. While established brands dominated the 15-pound tier, a new Ferguson mains radio might appear in a shop window for 8 or 9 guineas. It was an immediate shock to the market. For a working-class family in the Midlands, the North, or the rapidly expanding suburbs of London, that price difference was the boundary between silence and reception. It was the difference between hearing the news at the pub and hearing the news by the fireplace. But Thorne knew that a cheap radio still required a trusted salesman. Rather than fighting for space in the grand, exclusive department stores of central London, Ferguson aggressively courted the independent high-street electrical dealer. These were the small, local radio shops where the owner knew his customers by name, where the service counter was in the back room, and where trust was built over decades. Thorne offered these independent retailers highly competitive margins, strict geographical territories, and reliable service support. When a customer walked into a local shop complaining about the price of a famous name set, the dealer would point to the Ferguson on the shelf. The veneer might have been slightly thinner, and the internal chassis might have lacked the meticulous aesthetic wire dressing of a premium brand. But when the dealer clicked the volume control, the knob that changes the loudness of the sound, the valves warmed up and the loudspeaker moved the air with exactly the same authority. It pulled in the home service. It separated the regional stations. It did the job, and it left the customer with enough change to pay the grocer. By the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Ferguson had successfully anchored itself in the British market. The Enfield factory had expanded rapidly, its workforce swelling to meet the relentless high-street demand. The brand had proved that British manufacturing could be scaled for the working class without sacrificing the fundamental promise of reception. When the war forced the suspension of domestic radio production, the Enfield plant was requisitioned for military contracts. The workers who had been assembling cheap table radios were suddenly tasked with building complex aircraft equipment and military receivers. This wartime pivot was not a pause for Ferguson. It was a profound industrial education. The company learned how to manufacture complex electronics with military precision, at unprecedented speed, and on a massive scale. When peacetime eventually returned and the British public looked to restock their sitting rooms, Ferguson would be standing at the starting line with a factory town behind it, ready to build the definitive sound of the post-war home. By 1946, the British public was exhausted by wartime austerity. The utility wireless sets, basic unbranded receivers mandated by the government, were beginning to fail. Listeners craved domestic luxury, and the BBC responded to the national mood by launching the Light program, a national broadcasting service dedicated to music, comedy, and light entertainment. But to properly hear this new era of peacetime broadcasting, the British sitting room needed a new kind of receiver. For decades, the ultimate symbol of domestic audio prestige had been the radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet. Before the war, A high-quality radiogram was an exclusive, aristocratic object. Often encased in hand-polished walnut and heavy mahogany, it was priced far beyond the reach of an ordinary wage earner. It was a status symbol for the affluent, designed to dominate large, well-heated drawing rooms. Ferguson changed the entire geography of British domestic audio by democratizing the radiogram. The breakthrough was not a single miraculous engineering patent, but a brutal industrial process that turned a luxury item into a high-street commodity. Jules Thorne realized that his massive Enfield factory capacity could be redirected to build large, impressive wooden cabinets and reliable radio chassis at a speed his competitors simply could not match. When a working-class customer walked into a local high-street electrical shop in the early 1950s, they were met with a profound visual and tactile proposition. A typical Ferguson radiogram was a substantial, imposing piece of furniture. It featured a polished veneer cabinet that smelled faintly of warm lacquer, wood glue, and valve heat. Lifting the heavy wooden lid revealed a modern automatic record changer. But the true magic of the machine lay on the front panel. Here sat a wide, beautifully illuminated glass tuning dial, the scale that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to. Behind the warm glass, a mechanical pointer moved gracefully as the user turned the heavy bakelite knob, physically adjusting the tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many. The sound it produced was authoritative. Because a radiogram cabinet was large, it could house a substantial loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air. When tuned to the Droitwich transmitter, a Ferguson set filled the front room with a warm, rich bass that smaller, cramped table radios simply could not replicate. It separated the regional stations cleanly. It caught the faint, distant signals of Radio Luxembourg late at night. It made the voices feel as though they were in the room. But the true breakthrough was financial. A premium heritage brand might demand 50 or 60 guineas for a radiogram, requiring cash up front or punishing credit terms. Ferguson, operating with ruthless vertical integration, drove the retail cost down. Thorne began buying up his own cabinet-making firms and component suppliers, effectively stripping away the expensive middlemen. This was the British radio moat. No other domestic manufacturer could match the sheer, terrifying cost efficiency of the Enfield production line. Because the base price was so aggressively low, the Ferguson radiogram became the perfect engine for the post-war explosion of hire purchase, the British credit system colloquially known as the never-never. A family did not need to save for 3 years to buy a Ferguson. They only needed a few shillings for the weekly deposit at their local independent dealer, or at a growing high-street chain like Curry's. They signed the paper agreement, and the shop delivered the imposing wooden cabinet to their terraced house that same afternoon. This accessibility transformed the British weekend. The Ferguson radiogram became the undisputed focal point of the front room. It was the physical anchor for the family's entertainment schedule. The radio times rested permanently on its polished lid. Teenagers gathered around it to play the latest 78 RPM records, while parents relied on its illuminated dial to find the BBC Home Service in the dark during the harsh winter power cuts. The brand was suddenly ubiquitous. The enthusiast press, such as Wireless World and Practical Wireless, noted the robust, sensible engineering of the Ferguson chassis. They assured the sprawling network of high-street service engineers, the men with soldering irons in the back rooms of local shops, that while a Ferguson was built to a strict price, it was not built cheaply. It used standard, reliable valves and straightforward wiring. It was entirely simple to repair when a resistor or a capacitor eventually degraded. This endorsement from the repair bench was critical. A working-class family needed to know that if their hire purchase radiogram stopped speaking, the man at the end of the high street could fix it without ordering ruinously expensive bespoke parts. At the same time, Ferguson dominated the market for the standard mains radio, a radio that draws its power directly from the household electrical supply rather than batteries. For families who lacked the space for a radiogram, a Ferguson table radio offered the exact same promise of affordable reliability. These sets sat proudly on sideboards in Manchester, on kitchen shelves in Birmingham, and in the newly built post-war council estates of outer London. They were not built for naval communications, and they were not designed to be exhibited in modern art museums. They were built to survive the damp of a British winter, the fluctuating voltage of the post-war grid, and the daily, heavy-handed use of a busy household. By offering a reliable product, a generous margin to the shopkeeper, and an unbeatable price to the customer, Ferguson effectively conquered the British working-class market. They bypassed the snobbery of the traditional electronics establishment and spoke directly to the wage earner. Every detail of the product, from the sturdy knobs to the brightly lit station names printed on the glass, was designed to reassure the buyer that they had made a sound investment. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By the early 1960s, Ferguson was no longer merely a disruptive high-street alternative. It had become the industrial bedrock of British domestic audio. Jules Thorne had transformed a single Enfield assembly plant into Thorne Electrical Industries, a colossal manufacturing empire that dictated the pace, price, and presence of consumer electronics across the British Isles. The scale of production was staggering. The original Great Cambridge Road site in Enfield had expanded into a sprawling modern industrial complex, humming with thousands of workers. But even this vast facility could not satisfy the relentless demand of the British High Street. To maintain its dominance, the company opened massive new manufacturing centers in Gosport, Hampshire, and Spennymoor in County Durham. Entire local economies became tethered to the rhythm of the Ferguson production lines. Thousands of women were employed to meticulously solder components, wire chassis, and assemble the intricate tuning mechanisms that would soon sit in millions of British homes. Thorne had constructed an almost unassailable vertical monopoly. The company did not simply assemble radios from bought-in parts. It owned the engineering laboratories that designed the circuits. It owned the timber operations that cut the radiogram cabinets. It owned the plastic injection molding plants that formed the dials and knobs. It even owned the fleet of lorries that transported the finished wireless sets down the A1. This total control over the supply chain allowed Ferguson to maintain its aggressive pricing strategy while simultaneously increasing production volume to unprecedented levels. This industrial machinery perfectly positioned the brand to capitalize on the next great technological shift, the transition from the heavy static valve radio to the modern transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and entirely battery-friendly. Before the transistor, radio listening was a geographical commitment. A family gathered around the radiogram in the sitting room, constrained by the location of the mains plug and the size of the cabinet. The Ferguson transistor portables shattered this limitation. Models like the Ferguson Flare and the 3100 series democratized mobility. They were compact, cleanly designed, and wrapped in hard-wearing leatherette or brightly colored plastics. These sets featured a modern telescopic aerial, a collapsible metal rod that receives radio waves from the air, pulling in the VHF-FM band with surprising clarity for such a small unit. Inside, they utilized the newly adopted printed circuit board, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, replacing the slow, expensive process of point-to-point hand wiring. This portability fundamentally changed British listening habits. The sound of the BBC was no longer trapped in the front room. The Ferguson portable moved into the kitchen, resting on the Formica worktop beside the kettle to deliver the morning news. It traveled out to the garden shed, keeping the amateur mechanic company on a Sunday afternoon. It was carried to the local park on bank holidays. Crucially, it migrated into the teenager's bedroom. For the first time, a younger generation could retreat under the bed covers with a Ferguson battery radio, tuning the small plastic dial away from the BBC home service to hunt for the faint, thrilling signals of Radio Luxembourg or the offshore pirate stations broadcasting from the North Sea. To ensure these radios reached every corner of the country, Thorn engineered a masterclass in distribution. Ferguson sets were not only piled high in the windows of independent radio dealers, they dominated the catalogs of major national retailers like Currys and Dixon's. But Jules Thorn's most aggressive move was to absorb the high street rental market itself. Radio rental, a business model where customers rented radio or television equipment for a few shillings a week rather than buying it outright, was a cornerstone of British working-class commerce. Thorn aggressively expanded his own rental chain, DER, Domestic Electric Rentals, and eventually acquired the industry giant Radio Rentals. This meant that even if a customer did not explicitly choose to buy a Ferguson radio outright, they were overwhelmingly likely to be issued one when they signed a rental agreement on the high street. The Ferguson chassis, whether wearing its own badge or rebranded for a rental catalog, became the inescapable default hardware of the British audio experience. The sheer visibility of Ferguson across the British high street became absolute. If a consumer avoided the rental counter at DER or Radio Rentals, they would inevitably encounter the brand in Rumbelows, another major electrical retail chain absorbed into Jules Thorn's sprawling corporate empire. Every town centre, from Glasgow to Southampton, featured a shop window glowing with Ferguson tuning dials. Even the rapidly expanding mail-order sector, heavily driven by early Argos catalogues, relied on Ferguson to provide sensible, affordable audio products for the masses. This total retail saturation perfectly coincided with a seismic shift in British broadcasting. In 1967, the BBC completely restructured its national services. The familiar light program evolved into BBC Radio 2, providing reliable daytime music and entertainment for the kitchen and the workplace. The home service became BBC Radio 4, securing its place as the authoritative voice of news and domestic drama. Most importantly, the BBC launched Radio 1 to capture the explosive youth pop market, effectively replacing the offshore pirate stations. Ferguson was uniquely positioned to supply the hardware for this new era. A Ferguson portable radio, often powered by a heavy rectangular PP9 battery, became the essential tool for the British teenager. It was cheap enough to be bought with saved pocket money or gifted at Christmas, yet robust enough to be dragged into school playgrounds or hidden under bedsheets to listen to Tony Blackburn or John Peel late into the night. It caught the medium-wave broadcasts with a sturdy internal ferrite rod aerial, a small, hidden component wrapped in copper wire that pulled signals from the air without needing to be extended. Simultaneously, Ferguson refused to abandon the traditional front room. While the youth market embraced small transistors, the adults upgraded their audio furniture. The classic radiogram evolved into the stereogram, a wider, lower wooden cabinet designed to reproduce stereophonic sound, physically separating the left and right audio channels through two distinct loudspeakers for a richer, more immersive listening experience. A Ferguson stereogram in the 1970s was an imposing piece of domestic architecture. It allowed families to experience the BBC's expanding VHF-FM network in high fidelity. It featured complex tone controls, the dials that allowed the user to manually adjust the balance of treble and bass to suit the acoustics of their specific sitting room. These wide, veneered units dominated the corner of the room, acting as a display shelf for photographs and ornaments when not spinning records or tuned to the Sunday evening chart countdown. Because there were simply so many of them in circulation, Ferguson chassis became the absolute bedrock of the British repair culture. The magazines that fueled the enthusiast trade, such as Practical Wireless, regularly featured circuit diagrams for Thorne-built radios. The local high-street service engineer, the man in the brown dust coat who smelled of hot solder and melting flux, knew the internal geography of a Ferguson better than the layout of his own house. If a tuning capacitor failed, or a volume control slider became stiff and crackly with dust, the parts were entirely standardized and immediately available. The radio rarely had to be sent back to the manufacturer. It was fixed on the bench at the back of the local shop and returned to the customer by the weekend. By the early 1970s, the scale of this operation was breathtaking. Industry estimates suggest that at the peak of its manufacturing might, Thorne Electrical Industries was producing well over 1 million consumer electronic units annually across its British sites. The Enfield and Gosport factories were vast industrial cities in their own right, operating at a relentless, deafening rhythm to satisfy the domestic appetite. A Ferguson radio was not merely a consumer good, it was a structural, load-bearing pillar of the British domestic routine. If the Ferguson transistor on the kitchen worktop failed to find Radio 4, the household lost the morning news, and if the stereogram in the sitting room fell silent, the family lost its evening entertainment. This was the zenith of Jules Thorne's vision. He had broken the old cartels, mastered mass production, conquered the high street, and captured the rental market. Millions of British homes woke up, worked, and went to sleep to the sound of voices and music, pushed through a Ferguson loudspeaker. The brand was entirely unassailable, deeply entrenched in the daily life of the nation, and seemingly too massive to ever fail. The decline of the Ferguson radio empire did not begin with a sudden factory closure or a catastrophic product failure. In the late 1970s, the company appeared to be operating at the peak of its industrial strength. The high-street electrical shops were still stocked with Thorne-built audio equipment, and the vast rental network still provided a guaranteed pipeline to the British domestic market. But the structural foundations of this massive enterprise were already fracturing under the pressure of two specific market mechanisms: the relentless mathematics of British manufacturing costs and the changing definition of a mass-market radio receiver. Unlike a boutique heritage brand that could survive by selling a small number of expensive, handcrafted radios to devoted enthusiasts, Ferguson was built entirely on volume. It required millions of working-class customers to keep the sprawling assembly lines at Enfield, Gosport, and Spennymoor moving. When that mass market began to shift its loyalties, the sheer size of the Thorne empire transformed from an absolute advantage into a fatal liability. The first critical blow was struck by the arrival of Force 4, imports, private labels, and good enough listening. For decades, Ferguson had protected its British radio moat by simply outproducing and underpricing its domestic rivals. But by the early 1970s, a new wave of imported transistor radios from Japan, and increasingly from Hong Kong, began to flood the British high street. Companies like Sony, National Panasonic, and Sanyo did not initially attempt to build large, heavy wooden radiograms. Instead, they attacked the entry-level market: the teenager's bedroom, the kitchen worktop, and the holiday caravan. These imported portable radios were brutally effective. They were smaller, lighter, and, crucially, they looked aggressively modern. While a British-built Ferguson portable often relied on familiar wood-effect plastics, vinyl leatherette, and conservative styling, the Japanese imports utilized sleek silver plastics, brushed aluminum trim, and densely packed internal printed circuit boards. They offered a crisp, precise tuning dial and highly sensitive ferrite rod aerials for capturing the medium-wave band. More importantly, they sounded clear, and they were cheap. The British buyer, previously loyal to the Ferguson badge because it represented domestic value, found that the imported set could find BBC Radio 1 just as easily, often for a few pounds less. The cheaper radio did not need to last for decades, and it did not need to be passed down as an heirloom. It only needed to work on a picnic blanket, and the imports did that flawlessly. This competitive displacement triggered the devastating reality of Force 1. British cabinet, valve, transistor, component, labor and manufacturing costs. Jules Thorne's strategy of complete vertical integration, owning the timber yards, the plastics factories, and the component laboratories, had worked perfectly when domestic labor was affordable and the market was insulated. But as the 1970s progressed, British industrial relations became increasingly volatile. Inflation soared, and the fundamental cost of paying thousands of skilled British workers to assemble domestic electronics became unsustainable. The Asian manufacturers had mastered automated flow soldering and highly efficient global supply chains. A Ferguson radio, still reliant on substantial domestic labor for assembly, testing, and cabinet finishing, simply cost too much to build. The company found itself trapped in an impossible equation. If they maintained the build quality that British service engineers respected, they could not compete with the price of the imports. If they cheapened the internal chassis to match the Hong Kong price tags, they destroyed the foundational promise of the brand. A radio could still tune beautifully and still lose the shop shelf. The turning point arrived in the late 1970s. In 1976, Sir Jules Thorne, the architect of the empire, finally retired. Without his singular, ruthless focus on high-street electronics, the company began to drift. In 1979, Thorne Electrical Industries merged with the entertainment giant EMI to form Thorne EMI. This corporate consolidation changed the fundamental nature of the business. Ferguson was no longer an independent, hungry radio manufacturer fighting for space in a local dealer's window. It was merely one division within a sprawling, unwieldy conglomerate that owned everything from record labels and cinemas to defense contractors and medical equipment. In the boardrooms of Thorne EMI, the domestic production of a 20-pound portable radio or a basic kitchen receiver began to look like a low-margin distraction. Simultaneously, the brand was battered by Force 5, technological, retail, and listening culture shift. The classic British radiogram, the heavy wooden furniture that Ferguson had democratized after the war, died a sudden and highly visible death. The market rapidly shifted toward the hi-fi separate system, a modular audio setup where the amplifier, radio tuner, cassette deck, and record player were individual specialized units, usually stacked in a metal and glass rack. This new aesthetic was almost entirely dominated by Japanese engineering. The British public wanted brushed silver fascias, glowing LED volume meters, and precise, weighted tuning knobs. The heavy, polished veneer cabinets that had defined Ferguson's golden age looked instantly obsolete, like relics from a different century. The independent radio shop, where the dealer knew the Ferguson catalog by heart, was being rapidly replaced by the aggressive discount retailer and the sheer volume of the Argos catalog, where price was the only metric that mattered. The company scrambled to adapt, launching their own silver-faced audio systems and plastic clock radios, but the cultural authority had already shifted. When a young consumer saved up for their first serious stereo system in 1980, they did not look for the badge that their parents had trusted on a 1950s radiogram. They looked to Tokyo, not to Enfield. The retreat had quietly begun. The vast British factories that had built the post-war listening habit were suddenly operating on borrowed time. By the mid-1980s, The decline of Ferguson transformed from a gradual commercial retreat into a swift structural collapse. The newly formed conglomerate, Thorn EMI, faced severe financial pressure across its diverse industrial sectors. In the harsh economic landscape of Thatcherite Britain, the boardrooms looked coldly at domestic consumer electronics manufacturing. The massive, historic factory complex on the Great Cambridge Road in Enfield, alongside the vast assembly plants in Gosport and Spennymoor, suddenly faced the reality of modern corporate liquidation. The ultimate turning point occurred in 1987. Realizing that independent British manufacturing could no longer match the global supply chains of East Asia, Thorn EMI sold the Ferguson Radio Corporation outright to the French state-owned electronics giant Thomson. This corporate surrender was an immediate shock to the British industrial infrastructure. Thomson had no interest in maintaining expensive, unionized British factories or supporting a legacy network of high-street service counters. Their strategy was entirely driven by overseas manufacturing, moving production from the original British factories to lower-cost plants across Europe and Asia, while keeping the familiar Ferguson name simply as a retail badge to exploit decades of built-in British consumer trust. The consequences for the domestic workforce and listening culture were profound and immediate. The Enfield assembly lines, which had hummed with the sound of thousands of workers since 1936, fell completely silent. The heavy metal presses that stamped out chassis were sold for scrap. The specialized plastic injection molds for portable tuning dials were destroyed or shipped abroad. Thousands of skilled women, who had spent decades meticulously soldering resistors, capacitors, and transistor platforms, were redundant. Simultaneously, the high-street geography that had sustained Ferguson for generations collapsed. The high-street electrical shops and independent dealers were pushed out by massive out-of-town retail warehouses. Thorn's own retail empires crumbled. DER and radio rentals merged, downsized, and eventually closed their doors forever as consumers abandoned the traditional radio rental business model in favor of direct, low-cost credit purchases from hypermarkets. With the loss of the high street shop window, the traditional service network completely vanished. The local repair counter, where a service engineer could replace a fading component or realign a stiff tuning dial, disappeared from the British high street. Consumer electronics transformed from an asset to be maintained into a cheap, disposable commodity. If a radio stopped speaking, the customer no longer took it to the local technician. They threw it into the dustbin and bought another low-cost import. This shift triggered a severe process of brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original quality or identity. Under Thomson's ownership, and later through various licensing agreements, the Ferguson badge was slapped onto generic, low-cost electronics that the original Enfield engineers would not recognize. The name that had once defined the robust, beautifully veneered stereograms of the 1970s and the sturdy valve table radios of the post-war era was now printed on cheap, mass-produced digital clock radios. Small domestic radios combined with digital alarm clocks, sold on supermarket shelves or listed on the back pages of the Argos catalog. These imported units were made of thin, brittle plastic, featuring harsh digital displays instead of a warm, illuminated tuning scale, and tiny loudspeaker drivers that produced a tinny, fatiguing sound. The transition was absolute. The market had moved decisively from analog tuning to cheap digital presets, and eventually toward the early stages of the DAB shift. The Ferguson badge no longer represented a proud promise of domestic British engineering, vertical integration, or high-street reliability. It had become a hollow corporate ghost, a familiar font on a plastic box made half a world away, designed for the budget shelf where the buyer cared only about the low price tag. Completely indifferent to the industrial empire that had once carried the voices of a nation into the sitting rooms of Britain. The factories were empty. The service benches were gone. The high street shops were closed. The original Ferguson wireless had officially gone dark. The corporate afterlife of the Ferguson brand was a masterclass in modern retail indignity. After the French state-owned Thomson Group acquired the rights in 1987, the name was detached from its British manufacturing roots and used purely as a licensing tool. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the Ferguson badge appeared sporadically on cheap, imported CRT televisions, DVD players, and eventually budget DAB radios, the digital radio systems that replaced continuous analog signals with data. These units had no connection to Enfield or Gosport. They were generic, off-the-shelf Asian electronics, using a heritage British name to secure shelf space in supermarkets and discount electrical chains. Eventually, even this diluted presence faded. Today, the Ferguson name has almost entirely vanished from the British high street, surviving only as an occasional intellectual property exercise for low-end electronics sold through online marketplaces. As a British industrial giant, it died in 1987. As a corporate ghost, it simply faded away. However, the true legacy of Ferguson does not exist in corporate licensing ledgers. It survives strictly on the secondary market and the repair benches of the British vintage radio community. On eBay, Gumtree, and Facebook Marketplace, the original Enfield-built valve radios and stereograms are actively hunted. At the crowded swap meets of the British Vintage Wireless Society, collectors and amateur engineers trade Ferguson service manuals, schematic diagrams, and original spare parts. They seek out the specific tuning capacitors and exact match dial lamps needed to keep these mid-century machines alive. YouTube restoration channels dedicate hours of meticulous work to Ferguson chassis, filming the careful process of replacing degraded wax paper capacitors, cleaning the dusty valve pins, and polishing the heavy bakelite knobs until they shine. For a brand that was originally built and sold as a cheap, working-class commodity, it is now treated with immense historical reverence. The enthusiast community goes to this immense effort because an original Ferguson radio offers something that a modern smart speaker or smartphone app simply cannot replicate. It provides an honest, physical relationship with the act of listening. When a collector turns the heavy tuning dial on a 1950s Ferguson radiogram, they are mechanically shifting the internal plates of a capacitor, actively hunting for a broadcast signal moving through the air. The sound that eventually leaves the large paper cone loudspeaker is rich, warm, and distinctly physical, carrying an acoustic weight that heavily compressed modern digital audio often lacks. The original Ferguson was built to a strict price, but it was built with standard, accessible components that were designed to be repaired, not replaced. It was an object of permanence. The physical landscape where these objects of permanence were born has been completely erased. The geography of Jules Thorne's empire has been entirely rewritten by modern commercial development. The massive Great Cambridge Road factory in Enfield, which once employed thousands of workers and pumped out millions of wireless sets, is gone. The site was cleared and redeveloped into generic retail parks, fast food drive-thrus, and modern commercial distribution units. There is no visible monument, no grand blue plaque, to mark the exact spot where the sound of the British post-war sitting room was manufactured. In Gosport and Spennymoor, the vast factory floors that supported generations of local families have met similar fates, replaced by modern housing estates and anonymous industrial parks. The colossal physical footprint of the British domestic radio industry was simply paved over when the market looked east. Yet, the hardware occasionally outlasts the geography that produced it. A surprising, enduring footnote in the Ferguson story is the sheer stubborn resilience of their most basic post-war valve radios. Models that were originally mass-produced and sold as the cheapest entry-level receivers for British kitchens frequently surface in local charity shops or house clearances today, having sat untouched in lofts or cupboards for decades. When a brave restoration technician carefully applies mains voltage to the chassis, these supposedly disposable British sets often glow straight back to life. Their original glass valves, manufactured 70 years ago, still heat up flawlessly, and the radio immediately pulls in a medium-wave station, proving that Enfield's brutal cost-cutting never entirely compromised the fundamental engineering. Ultimately, the story of Ferguson is the ultimate reflection of the British consumer electronics market. It reveals the brutal widening gap between what the country nostalgically claims to value: domestic employment, robust engineering, repairable household goods, and familiar high street service, and what the modern retail market actually rewards: relentless cost-cutting, disposable convenience, and frictionless global supply chains. Jules Thorne built an unprecedented industrial empire by giving the British working class exactly what they needed at a fair price. But that empire collapsed the moment the definition of a fair price was no longer dictated by British factories, but by an international market that prized the cheapness of the object over the survival of the industry that made it. The factories are silent, the rental chains are gone, and the high street shop windows no longer glow with the names of British engineers. But somewhere in Britain, a heavy wooden Ferguson radiogram is still sitting quietly in the corner of a sitting room, its polished veneer catching the afternoon light, its glass tuning dial waiting for a hand to turn the knob and find one more voice in the air. See you in the next one.